Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Concerts and Conversations. We're very happy to have with us today Catherine Turocy, the director of the New York Baroque Dance Company, with whom Ars Lyrica has collaborated on numerous projects over the years. Today's conversation will span the length of our collaboration, really, and talk about some Monteverdi work that we did in 2012. A Charpentier chamber opera that was done more recently, and finally last fall's collaboration on Rameau and Compra in a show called Dancing at the Palais. Catherine, it's great to have you with us. I wanted to start this conversation by inviting all the musicians out there, especially who have at least some knowledge of Baroque dance, because there are a lot of people who do, to think a little bit more broadly about this whole topic of dance during the 17th and 18th century. For my part, when I first learned how to dance a minuet, for example, in the summer course at Stanford during graduate studies there, everything was about French court dance because Wendy Hilton was there. She wrote the book on the subject. But we got great training in all of those intricate French steps from the late 17th, early 18th century. We didn't learn much, to be honest, about any other kind of styles of dance because that was seen to be the kind of normative form of Baroque dance. And yet there are distinct Italian, French styles, and probably other national styles that I don't know much about. But let's start with the Monteverdi project that we did a number of years ago. How did you come up with an idea of what dance or choreography in those pieces of Monteverdi might look like? And I might add here that we did the Combattimento of Tancredi and Clorinda, and also the Ballo delle Ingrate, two pieces from fairly late in his career that are a little eccentric. They're not really operas so much as staged dramas.
Yes. Well, first of all, I think one needs to make a distinction between ballroom dance and a ballet. And the treatises by Negri and Carozzo give an idea of what the dance looked like at the time in terms of doing pavans and galliards, canaries. But they also give an idea of deportment, of how you carry yourself. And I think that they give a pretty good understanding of the actual sort of figures that one makes in the space and the importance of, like, these figures are tracings that the dancers make. So their books normally deal with duets. Occasionally they'll deal with like 3 or 4 people. And in this case, when we're looking at Monteverdi, you're talking about more of a theatrical interpretation. So one has to look a little bit further before and after to understand what the discussion was about making dance an art form. Because one of the things that I ask myself when I'm looking back to the Renaissance, and especially early Renaissance, is what happened? You know, why do you have these folk dances that have, you know, wonderful serpentine weavings in them that you also see in the ballets? And they also have stepping steps in them. Why suddenly do you have something that's called art? And I think for me, the most revealing book that I actually read about that, what came recently, it's called The Eloquence of the Body, and it's written by Jennifer Neville. And it looks at, you know, comparing the Italian masters and reading exactly what they're saying about the steps and about the measurement of the steps, and talking about how that layer of theory in dance is sort of parallel to the theory in music in terms of just even the word measure. Mm-hmm. So this is something that, you know, doesn't come spontaneously with suddenly, okay, I'm going to, you know, start to study the dance of the 1600s and where do I go? What do I do? It's really, for me, it's been a question of studying the treatises from the 18th century and then going back and speaking and working with some of the experts who are from this who are working in the Italian treatises. So for the Monteverdi, I got the step vocabulary actually from the ballroom sources because they pretty much describe the steps and the nature of the steps. But in terms of getting the drama, you really have to go to letters or to diaries of the people who were there at the time who describe what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the most sort of shocking description, if I can look here for a moment, was actually coming from one of the witnesses of the ballo.
Quick question. You mentioned the fact that dances and music were essentially starting to be thought of in terms of measures at some point in the early 17th century. There was dancing, of course, before then in the 16th century, and music, for the most part, had no measures at that point. There were no bar lines until the invention of the basso continuo. So I'm kind of curious, do you have any idea how people talked about segments, that is to say step units, in the Renaissance, that is before the invention of the bar line?
Well, they still talk about it in terms of measure. I'm just thinking even in like orchesography, which is basically like 1589, they do talk about measures, although I don't think you necessarily see measures in the musical notation.
Right, they're probably talking about it in relationship to then the tactus, which was a strong concept through the Renaissance. The idea that there's a kind of background beat that encompasses usually the whole bar, as opposed to a measure line that actually divides the bar,
right. So
the notation one from another.
When did the music notation start using the lines in their notation system?
Right around 1600. It's a really convenient dividing line, that turn of the century, because that's when we start seeing particularly continuo bass lines for early operas, and those kinds of pieces that relied on this new modern style. And they needed a way to coordinate essentially the vocal line usually with the continuo line, to keep the singers and the continuo players at the same place. And so occasionally they would just put a vertical slash in, so that you would know, okay, that word needs to be with this note, despite the fact that it's kind of, there in relationship to each other. The bar line kind of sorts it out. It didn't really instill anything like a sense of a measure or a strong accent. Instead, it was simply an organizing device for the most part. Eventually, it was taken up fairly quickly into other kinds of music because people found it useful. But the notion of the tactus, I think, must have held together this concept of whatever a unit was in choreography in the 16th century.
Well, also, when you're talking to a dancer about a measure, we're thinking about measured space. So we're thinking about space in a room. That is a measure to us. So our actual space corresponds with the tactus, then, what you're talking about. So I have to say that for my work, when I'm going into Monteverdi, I'm really sort of coming from understanding what he led to, or what came after the whole opera tradition that eventually blossomed in the late 17th and 18th centuries. So I'm going from understanding their use of the music and the dance to bolstering it up with referring to both original treatises, but also people's discussion of these treatises from our own time. Because it's not easy going into history. It's not easy going into, especially a time that's from the late, 1500s or the middle 1500s, understanding the use of the language and their concepts of the universe, their concepts of, the harmony of the spheres, and, how is dance relating to that? And I think that through reading specifically this discussion of Jennifer Neville, where she really compares the dancing masters from those earlier times, it becomes apparent that they were really trying to take dance and put it into the same logical, mathematical form as music, so that dance as a sister art is, and they call it a sister art, is related to music and can also be part of the liberal arts. It's very important for dance to be a part of that. Otherwise, if it's not going to carry on with its importance in society.
Right. You mentioned something that's crucial, I think, for anybody involved in an art form that seeks to create something with some historical authenticity. It's hard to read a treatise because they're not written for us. They were written for people hundreds, sometimes thousands of years ago, who had different expectations, who brought different levels of education, and oftentimes just unpacking them and trying to tease out the nuggets of information that are actually useful is the major part of the work.
Right. And the author, of course, is writing for somebody who already has seen ballet, or who has heard the music, who plays, who's been educated. And that really is the challenge. So the way our company works is not only as like individual artists, but also there's somewhat of a more collaborative and supportive effort when it comes to finding original materials and making concepts. So one of the people, Federico Foligno, was describing the ballo, the ballet of the ingrates. That's just to translate. He says, one woman lags behind for a long time and then bursts forward in tear-filled accents, accompanied by sighs and sobs, and she fills the audience with pity. So obviously there's a sense of, in the pantomime or the expressive dance, there's a sense of the Italian passion. And it's constrained enough that it's not too much, but it's definitely not as constrained, I think, as the French or the English would be expressing their music. He talks about, Foligno also talks about the costumes, and he says that the people were masked, that they had something that looked like burning hair made of net. And that it looked like there were flames coming out of their costumes. There were special jewels, incredible jewels that were embedded in the hair and also in the costumes to give that sense of light, or that sense of burning. He also talks about the ashes. It looks like the hair has ashes on it. It's gray, but there are silver and gold threads going through the hair. And also it looked like glowing coals. And he says that there are signs of a former beauty. Now, when you think of all that and you understand that they were men who were performing in the ballet as these women, it's I don't know, this is like maybe an aesthetic that we're not accustomed to seeing. It sounds to me, whenever you have the opposite sex playing the sex, the player, that there's a shade of distance that gives maybe more poignancy and truth to the portrayal. For instance, just like in Japanese theater, when the women's roles are played by the men, there's something about that sense of representation that they're able to do because that's what they have to do, that gives an art to the portrayal of the character that becomes even more compelling. And the fact that the men who were performing in this ballet were related to the bride, like her father, I think her father-in-law, that is very interesting. It's a personal, it's more personal somehow. Very extravagant gift, really, to the wedding couple to put this kind of a ballet on. But oh my God, what a subject! You know, the women who decided not to get married. You know, you wonder about that, and I think that's what's so interesting about these Italian works, or some of the Italian works, is that, you know, you're not necessarily talking about you're using metaphor. He's not talking about the mythologically condemned women. He's just talking about the women coming up from the underworld, and these are who they are, and maybe you recognize them. That's kind of haunting.
Catherine,
especially when you think it was done for a wedding.
Yeah.
And this is something that I just love to hear you talk about, that concept of why is that so important to not have direct association for your audiences, right? If it's so precise and so specific, then you can't imagine yourself in that role. You've spoken to this about how having a more open-ended interpretation or allows for that allegory or those relationship things, and allows for the audience then to connect more so because they can overlay themselves and their situations onto a less specific vision.
Right. Yeah. So you're really talking about the effect of representation in dramatic presentation. It gives one perspective. Then you're able to have perspective as opposed to getting lost in the emotion.
And it also, I think, activates the audience's imagination a little bit more. One of my favorite performances, Catherine, that you gave yourself as a soloist a number of years ago with Mercury was it called Les Caractères de la Danse?
Right, exactly.
Which is a solo that you performed masked. So we couldn't see your face. But the range of emotions that you managed to get out of your gestures enabled me as an audience member to read all sorts of things into what was going on in your face, even though the mask never changed. I thought that was magical. And I never imagined that kind of thing could be possible. It was really a revelation for me.
Thank you. Yeah, that's having what they called at the period, the knowledge of the mask.
Yeah.
So what the mask does is allows the performer to get in touch with more subtle energies and poses and, you know, ways of revealing the inner workings of the character. Because you're not worried about the audience, you know, looking at the face.
Right.
And looking here to find the changing emotion. Because when we're speaking to people, we're all, and you know, here we are, we're on a like little square. You know, we're always looking at the eyes, the nose, we're looking at, you know, the tilt of the head, what's going on. And sometimes we miss the rest of the body when you're looking at a dance. So it's really like almost the puppet of the dancer's body that is able to give immediate attitudes that people relate to in terms of understanding. And I think the beautiful thing about Les Caractères is that you're changing your sense of musicality in the body with the changing meters and the changing forms that sort of run by. And because it's all condensed into just one solo, it means that the dancer has to have a very strong sense of where all these different forms and characters come from. So it's like a base. You have to have a very good sense of base, because if you know where it's coming from originally, then you can transform almost like, you know, a salamander changing colors. You know, you can just sort of immediately go there or eventually go there. But if you don't have that core or that base and an understanding of that, then you're jumping artificially from one thing to another to another. And then it becomes a little bit like watching someone who's insane, following them through their changes, as opposed to watching almost the discussion or the poetry inside the performer, which is changing from these different characters.
Yeah.
One of the things I like about, all the groups in Houston is that you do reference each other, which makes it, again, a stronger community.
With that, maybe we should move to the late 17th century and to France for a bit of chat about Charpentier.
Yes, that sounds like a great idea.
Because several years ago, we collaborated on a production of Charpentier's Les Arts Florissants with a small cast and a small band, all of whom were on stage for this production that Catherine directed and choreographed. This is an example of a chamber opera from a French composer who couldn't produce grand opera in the late 17th century because Lully had essentially taken that territory for himself with the king's approval. So instead, Charpentier put on little chamber operas in the home of his patroness, Mademoiselle de Guise, and occasionally had things performed at court as well, we think. This is a 30-minute marvel, I think, of conversation essentially about the various arts, including a number of dances and some really lovely singing. So Catherine, in approaching something like that Charpentier piece, where do you start and where do you go?
Well, part of it is just understanding why was it written and who's performing, why are they performing, why are there so few people involved, for instance, which is very interesting. It was because Lully had the patent on opera. You were only allowed to have so many voices, so many dancers. Usually the number of dancers matched the number of voices or characters in the piece. So that definitely gives you some sense. But why are they celebrating Louis XIV? And part of it is the joy at suddenly having a peace treaty signed, the joy of holding back the Ottoman Empire, the joy of some success at a particular moment in French history and European history where Louis XIV was and his allies were successful in, you know, holding on to the land. And also there's like this constant reference of war, but also the arts flourishing against that backdrop with the peace, so that you can't have the arts flourishing unless there is peace. So I think philosophically, it's you're really looking at a balance between war and peace, between discord and harmony. Maybe one doesn't exist without the other. I don't know. In their libretti from the 17th century and always going all the way through Rameau, whenever they are having this war and peace conflict, you understand that that negative character who's called discord sometimes, who's called envy in other operas, that they're chained. They're just put into, they're not tamed. They're not killed because they're immortal. And it's just it's an interesting thing to deal with then, when dramatically you're going along with the music, because the music is struggling between, now here come the warriors and here comes discord and his furies, and this is what they're doing, and how are we going to capture that? And you know, how does that give expression then to the dance? It's lovely because what's interesting always is contrast. So you've got the good and the evil. You have the heroes, and then you have these furies. And in movement terms, they move very, very differently. I mean, any of the heroes are very upright. They have fighting bodies. They're strong. They're balanced. And I did use some kind of sword work in that. Sometimes I might use a sword, sometimes a fencing foil, depending on the occasion. But you have a chance to have that martial body. And they did like, even just as in the Renaissance, they did like restaging battles or having fighting as part of the dance. So that happens in Les Arts Florissants. Then the idea of going the opposite way with the furies. So if the heroes are up like this, then the furies are down like that. And they have more grotesque and exaggerated leg work. They're not balanced, but they're imbalanced. They're unpredictable. And I think that Alexis Silver was able to give a wonderful rendition of this in our last Les Arts Florissants, with her sort of almost groveling around discord and listening, and the idea of just throwing, really throwing and tossing some kind of ball of fury, into the audience. Mm-hmm. That this is very much a part of the frightening part, whereas the soldiers coming up with, again, they were masked, and with their sense of strong rhythms, but also upright posture, joining the earth with the heavens. That was the force that won. And then when you have the other characters coming in, for instance, Peace, I believe it was Carly Fox who gave a sense of the compassion that comes with peace, and the idea that you're changing the wreath that represents the warrior with another wreath. So the laurels are being exchanged for myrtle, and myrtle is representing more peaceful times, more the flourishing of the arts. So just by really reading the poetry of the libretto, you get so much, as a stage director and choreographer, you get so much information about how to shape the action on the stage.
Yeah, and it's funny how little has changed over time. We still tend to oppose peaceful existence with scourges of some kind, whether they be biological
Right.
or otherwise.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think if we do that, maybe we have a feeling we have control over it, you know, we make it into art and perhaps there's a reason.
Yeah, is somebody working on a Corona opera, I wonder?
I
Surely.
probably, yeah, it would be interesting to look back and see. I mean, I'm sure there must be operas that were inspired by the plague. Um,
There's certainly a lot of music that was. Operas, I'm not sure. But there are a lot of discrete pieces that we could name. In fact,
yeah.
one by Charpentier. He wrote a piece called The Plague of Milan.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a big motet.
Well, I think there's just something so profound about that music that somehow does lift one's spirits. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not that it's happy, it's just that it goes so far into the depth of loss and despair that you can't go any deeper, and then it sort of rises out of it. And I think that idea of rising out of it is what it gives people hope.
Yeah.
And that's I mean, that's the power of music, the power of dance, the power of literature and art, and why we need it so much right now.
Finally, the collaboration we did last fall, which combined some discrete geometric style dances in couples from some choreography that survives for a compra opera, Hesione, which was put together recently, the music that is, in addition by John Powell, a good friend and colleague who's at the University of Tulsa, and Catherine realized the choreography for that. And we also did in the second half of the program 3 suites from Les Indes Galantes of Jean-Philippe Rameau, 2 of which Catherine provided some theatrical choreography for. So in a nutshell, Catherine, the difference between working with, say, the surviving compra choreography versus the more theatrical approach in the Rameau?
Well, I'd like to speak to the advantages for the dancers in the company for doing this. It was a great opportunity for me to say, okay, this is the notation. Let's go ahead and reconstruct it together. So it gave them an opportunity to really look at the details of the choreography. So they were able to read it. And some people are better at reading than others. So, you know, we did have that. Sometimes I partnered one person who didn't read the notation with another person who did, so that there could be discussions that come up in rehearsal that one might overlook if I'm just teaching them the dance.
Mm-hmm.
So we were able to get more into the detail of their choices as performers for rhythmic choices, especially in the measures where they're very, very dense with changes of weight. The usual ballroom dances, so not the theatrical dances, but usual ballroom dances are, you know, a little bit more obvious. You know, we have a triple meter, there are 3 notes, we're doing a pas de bourrée, so step on each beat, 1, 2, 3.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you have something that's more like in a 6/8, and you're counting and you're emphasizing 1, 3, 4, 6, then and you have actually maybe 3 units. You might have a coupe, a pas de bourrée, and then some kind of semblé sisson all in one measure. So that's I mean, that's more than 4 shifts of weight. So how do you use your energy so that you can see the shadows of the main beats? So how do you shadow a particular action? And I think that
I remember actually being surprised at some of those movements, because when I read through the music myself, I kind of assumed what I thought were reasonable tempos for all of those compra dances. But then when we put them with the choreography, we suddenly realized that, okay, the density of notation for that single bar of 6/8 is such that it can't go at the tempo where I thought it belonged. It had to be slowed down kind of to a much more luxurious state in the case of several. And that was really quite an eye-opening experience for me. I didn't think, just looking at the notation, that the dances should go that slowly, but they work.
right, exactly. And I think that's, you know, what I love working about, what I like about working with you, Matthew, is that you're able to go ahead and perceive that sense of physicality that's needed by the dance measure to make it musical. Because of course we could just go bum, 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 and bat it out. But when you do that, then you don't have any sense of swing, or you don't have any sense of breath for the dance. And that definitely needs to be reflected in the music. I like your willingness to sort of rethink the shape of the music and how that's going to be working with what's our evidence, really. So what's interesting about those reconstructions is that you do have the printed evidence of the dance. So it's not someone who's interpreting the music and saying, we'll come up with the choreography. It's more like you're interpreting the music, I'm interpreting what's been written from the dance, and then we're finding that middle ground where they're both working, as I would say, in the Baroque period, in harmony.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're both interpreting written notation and ruining the fact that nobody in the 1680s left us a video of the whole thing so that we would just know.
Yeah, exactly. Or that my teacher wasn't around to say, hey, this is how it went. Yeah. So then for the dancers to go from that experience, because we started first on doing the notations, and that took them a couple months just to really get settled with that. And it's, again, you know, like my experience with reconstructing from notation is vast, because that's, I mean, I've looked at all the dances. But for the people in the company, they're coming to their understanding of the work as interpreters of the dance with different backgrounds and with different amounts of time spent in this. And so it was really helpful then for them to get that maybe communal experience, and for the people who knew more to bring the people who knew less along with them, then to go into the choreography for the rameau. Because when we were talking about the reconstructions, I could talk about some of the theory behind choreographing. And then I take that same base of theory and I use that to create my own choreography to the rameau. So they would then understand why I chose to turn this way or to turn that way or to use this rhythm. So they, in a way, had a more analytical experience putting together that program than they would have if I was just putting on an opera and there's no time to explain everything. Right. So what you were able to offer us as artistically was an exploration that really looked at the theory behind the choreography that created the performance and allowed the dancers to experience that through reading the notation, but also I then took that opportunity to explain my choreographic choices.
Cool, and it was a great opportunity for John, especially to see that music actually come alive on the stage. He'd been working on that edition for a while. Here's hoping that some company, maybe Ars Lyrica, maybe somebody else, will be able to do the entire opera at some point.
That would really be thrilling to be able to do the whole opera. Yeah, and especially when you have those kernels of evidence and that you can just sort of bloom from those.
Yeah.
you.